There's a hidden power in every word we speak, a power that can heal or hurt, unite or divide, uplift or destroy. Words are not just sounds or scribbles on a page. They are living forces that shape the world around us. The way we communicate colors our relationships, molds our communities, and even reflects the state of our own hearts. In a world that often feels rushed and divided, where conversations sometimes spiral into conflict and misunderstanding, the art of speaking both truthfully and kindly feels more vital than ever. It's a delicate dance, telling the truth without causing pain, showing kindness without hiding reality. And this balance is no accident. It is a wisdom cultivated for thousands of years within the teachings of Buddhism, a path that reveals how speech, when practiced with care, can become a bridge to peace, both within ourselves and with others. Buddhism doesn't just ask us to speak truthfully as a moral rule to follow blindly. It invites us to see truthfulness as a way to clear the fog of delusion in our minds, to be genuine in a world full of masks. But truth alone can be sharp, cutting like a sword. That's why kindness, loving kindness or metta, is the gentle hand that guides how we deliver the truth. When paired together, truth and kindness create an unstoppable force for harmony, trust, and healing. Imagine a conversation where every word feels authentic yet warm, honest yet gentle. Imagine how different our lives would be if we all spoke with this balance, where we neither tiptoe around reality nor batter others with harshness. This is the art we are about to explore. It's not just about what you say, but how you say it, why you say it, and the ripple effect your words create. In the next moments, we'll dive deep into the roots of truthful speech in Buddhist wisdom, uncover the heart of compassionate communication, and discover practical ways to transform our conversations. Stories from the Buddha himself will illuminate the path, showing us how this timeless art is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. So, as we begin, take a breath. Notice the weight and potential of your own words, the seeds you plant with each sentence, the power you hold in your voice. Because speaking truthfully and kindly is not just about language, it's a way of being. And it has the power to change everything. When we think about truth, it's easy to reduce it to simple facts: is something true or false? But in Buddhism, truthfulness runs much deeper. It's not just about accuracy or avoiding lies. It's a fundamental quality of the mind and heart that shapes how we live and relate to the world. At the very core of Buddhist ethics lies the commitment to speak the truth. One of the 5 precepts, the basic guidelines that help practitioners live with integrity. These precepts aren't strict commandments, but rather mindful choices, practices that gradually free us from suffering and confusion. Among them, the vow to abstain from false speech teaches us that honesty is a path to clarity, trust, and inner peace. But what does truthfulness really mean here? It's not just about not lying. It's about being sincere, letting our words genuinely reflect what we know and feel. It means resisting the temptation to manipulate, exaggerate, or withhold reality to serve selfish ends. It means opening ourselves up honestly, even when it's uncomfortable or risky. The Buddha taught that false speech creates entanglement. When we twist or hide the truth, we weave a web of delusion around ourselves. Our minds become clouded with confusion, and our relationships suffer from mistrust. On the other hand, truthful speech clears the fog. It helps us see things as they are, both within and outside ourselves. This clarity brings freedom. When we speak honestly, we don't have to carry the burden of deception or fear of being found out. Our minds are lighter, and we can engage with others openly, building genuine connection and respect. Yet Buddhism also understands that truthfulness isn't always easy. Sometimes, what we know to be true can hurt, can cause conflict, or challenge deeply held beliefs. This is where the wisdom of balance comes in. Truthfulness without compassion can become cold or cruel. That's why truthfulness in Buddhism isn't just a rule but a practice of awareness. It asks us to tune into our intentions and the effects our words have. Are we speaking truth to uplift, to liberate, or simply to win an argument? Are we aware of how our words land in another's heart? This foundation of truthfulness is not about rigid perfection, but about sincere effort, a daily commitment to walk the path of honesty with kindness and humility. As we unfold this journey, you'll see how this deep commitment to truthfulness connects with the heart of kindness, creating a way of speaking that transforms not just our conversations, but the very quality of our lives. If truthfulness forms the solid foundation of our speech, then kindness is the warm heart that breathes life into it. Without kindness, even the most honest words can feel cold, sharp, and alienating. But when truth is wrapped in compassion, it becomes a healing force, one that nurtures connection, softens wounds, and invites openness. In Buddhist teachings, this loving kindness is called metta, a boundless goodwill extended not only to others but also to ourselves. It's the gentle energy that turns speech from a mere exchange of information into an act of care. Think for a moment about a time when someone told you the truth, but it felt like a blow. Harsh words can stick like thorns, leaving scars that linger long after the conversation ends. This is why kindness matters so deeply. It's not enough to be truthful. How we say something can change everything. Kindness in communication means choosing words that uplift rather than tear down. It means listening with patience and responding with empathy. It means pausing to consider the impact of our words before letting them fly free. The Buddha emphasized that speech should not only be true but also beneficial and timely. Sometimes, saying less is more, and silence can be the kindest choice. Other times, speaking up with gentle honesty can prevent misunderstandings and foster deeper trust. This compassionate approach is a radical invitation to slow down, to step out of reactive patterns where we speak to win or defend ourselves. Instead, it calls us to speak from a place of genuine care, aware of the feelings and dignity of the person before us. When kindness becomes the guide, truthfulness transforms from a potential weapon into a bridge. It opens doors rather than slamming them shut. It invites curiosity instead of judgment. It creates space for dialogue and healing. The magic of kind speech lies not only in its ability to soothe others, but also in how it softens our own hearts. When we speak kindly, we cultivate patience, humility, and understanding within ourselves, qualities that ripple out and transform every interaction. In a world often overwhelmed by harsh words and quick judgments, practicing kindness in communication is a revolutionary act. It's a quiet but powerful rebellion against cruelty and indifference. As we continue, we'll discover how this heart of compassion finds its perfect balance with the clarity of truthful speech, a balance that forms the essence of the Buddhist path known as right speech. In Buddhism, the path to awakening is often described as the middle way, a journey that avoids extremes and finds balance in every step we take. When it comes to how we speak, this middle way is embodied perfectly in the teaching of right speech, one of the 8 guiding principles of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right speech is not just about what we say, it's about the quality and intention behind our words. It calls us to navigate the delicate space between silence and speech, honesty and kindness, clarity and compassion. The Buddha laid out 4 essential guidelines for right speech that serve as a compass for mindful communication. First, abstain from false speech. Avoid lying or distorting the truth. This connects deeply with what we've explored about truthfulness as a virtue. Deception clouds understanding and breeds distrust, creating barriers between ourselves and others. Second, abstain from divisive speech. Refrain from words that cause discord, foster conflict, or pit people against each other. Gossip, rumors, and harsh criticisms can fragment communities and poison relationships. Right speech encourages us to choose words that build bridges rather than walls. Third, abstain from harsh speech. Avoid words that wound, insult, or humiliate. Even truthful words, if spoken harshly, can cause suffering. The Buddha reminds us that gentle words, spoken with kindness, have the power to heal and calm. And fourth, Abstain from idle chatter. Refrain from meaningless or frivolous talk that wastes energy and distracts from what truly matters. This isn't about being silent all the time, but about valuing speech that carries purpose and mindfulness. Together, these principles create a framework that balances truth and kindness without tipping into cruelty or deceit. Right speech is a practice of intentional communication. It asks us to be fully present with what we say, how we say it, and why. It's about choosing words that are truthful, harmonious, gentle, and meaningful. These four qualities form the heartbeat of right speech. Truthful, so our words reflect reality and honesty. Harmonious, so they promote peace and understanding. Gentle, so they soften the hearts of both speaker and listener. Meaningful, so they add value and depth to our interactions. Living right speech is not easy. It requires vigilance and patience as we unlearn harmful habits, the impulsive reactions, the careless jokes, the gossip that slips out without thought. But with practice, it becomes a natural way of being, an expression of our inner growth. Right speech transforms everyday conversations into opportunities for healing, learning, and connection. It helps us navigate difficult discussions with grace and clarity, allowing truth and kindness to coexist in harmony. This is the essence of the middle way, not rigid rules or blind obedience, but a mindful path that adapts to each moment with wisdom and compassion. Next, we'll explore how to bring this wisdom into practical, everyday life learning techniques that help us speak truthfully and kindly, even in the most challenging situations. It's one thing to understand the principles of truthful and kind speech. It's another to live them, especially in a world where conversations can be messy, emotions can run high, and words often slip out faster than wisdom can catch them. But like any meaningful practice, the art of speaking truthfully and kindly is a skill, and skills can be cultivated. They grow with patience, attention, and a willingness to slow down. So how do we begin? How do we turn beautiful ideas into living, breathing habits of the tongue and heart? Let's start with a simple, timeless tool, the pause. Before you speak, pause, not forever, not awkwardly, just long enough to check in with yourself. Ask silently, is what I'm about to say true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? This tiny gap between impulse and action is where wisdom lives. In that moment, you have the power to shape your words with intention, to let them rise not from habit or ego, but from clarity and compassion. Next, practice listening more than speaking. It might seem strange that the key to good speech is listening, but it makes perfect sense. When we listen deeply, not just to the words but to the feelings beneath them, we attune ourselves to what others truly need. We stop reacting and start responding. Another powerful technique is to choose your tone carefully. Words carry energy not just in their meaning but in their delivery. A harsh truth spoken with tenderness becomes an offering of care. A simple correction delivered with respect can strengthen a bond rather than break it. When you need to speak a difficult truth, frame it with empathy. Begin by acknowledging the other person's feelings or perspective. You might say, "I understand this might be hard to hear," or "I want to share this because I care about our relationship." These phrases create space for openness and soften the edges of hard conversations. Practice timing. Not every truth must be spoken immediately. Wisdom knows when to hold and when to release. If emotions are raw, if someone isn't ready, or if circumstances would turn your words into fuel for conflict, it's often kinder and more skillful to wait. Another valuable technique is reframing. Instead of focusing on blame or criticism, express your feelings and needs. Use I statements rather than you accusations. For example, instead of saying, "You're always ignoring me," try, "I feel unheard when conversations get interrupted, and I'd appreciate your attention." This subtle shift transforms conflict into conversation and defensiveness into understanding. And perhaps most importantly, practice self-kindness in speech. Notice how you talk to yourself. The inner voice that narrates your day, comments on your mistakes, and sets the tone for your self-worth, it matters. The way we speak internally shapes how we speak externally. When we cultivate inner kindness, we naturally extend it outward. Consider daily reflections. At the end of each day, quietly review your conversations. Not with harsh self-judgment, but with gentle curiosity. Where did your words uplift? Where might you have done better? This reflective practice strengthens awareness and slowly rewires habitual patterns. And remember, no one does this perfectly. The art of speaking truthfully and kindly is a lifelong journey, not a destination. Every day offers fresh chances to practice, to learn, to begin again. With each mindful word, each compassionate pause, you're not just improving your communication, you're shaping the energy of your relationships, your community, and your own heart. In the next chapter, we'll explore the silent, often overlooked power of restraint, learning when words are not needed, and how silence, when held with wisdom, can speak volumes. Sometimes, words alone can't teach what a good story can. There's something timeless, almost sacred, about a simple tale that carries within it a hidden truth, a truth that seeps quietly into the heart, changing us not through argument but through recognition. The Buddha understood this well. His teachings weren't built on lofty doctrines alone, but also on stories, parables drawn from the everyday world, revealing wisdom through the ordinary. And so tonight, let me tell you a few. There's a story of a man who came to the Buddha, furious, shouting insults, trying to provoke him. But the Buddha sat still, his face calm, his voice soft. And when the man was done, the Buddha asked, "If a person brings a gift to another and the gift is not accepted, to whom does the gift belong?" The man, confused, answered, "To the one who offered it." The Buddha smiled and said, "Then so it is with your anger. I do not accept it and it remains yours." In those few words, he taught not just about speech, but about energy, how we don't have to receive the poison others offer. That calmness, that refusal to engage with hatred, is one of the highest forms of right speech. Knowing when to be silent and how to let unkind words dissolve in the air. Another tale tells of a monk named Kasyapa who lived humbly and spoke gently. Once, when accused unjustly of wrongdoing, he simply bowed and replied, "If I have done this, may I bear the consequences. If not, may the truth protect me." The accuser, seeing his sincerity, was struck silent and later confessed his mistake. In this, we see the wisdom of restraint, that sometimes the gentlest response is no defense at all, but a quiet trust in the unfolding of truth. And beyond the Buddhist tradition, countless cultures have held stories reminding us of the power of words. In ancient China, there's a saying, "A word spoken can never be taken back, like an arrow released from a bow." It reminds us to weigh our speech with care, knowing its impact may outlive the moment it's spoken. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "Before you speak, let your words pass through 3 gates. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind?" A wisdom echoed centuries later by Buddhist teachers and modern mindfulness guides alike. Why do these stories endure? Because they point to something universal. No matter where or when we live, the need for kind, truthful, and mindful communication never changes. Each story teaches in its own way. That anger offered can be left unclaimed. That silence is sometimes the most powerful reply. That gentle honesty disarms cruelty. That words shape not just moments but lives. And so, as we reflect on these tales, we realize this practice of right speech is not about perfect phrases or clever responses. It's about embodying wisdom. It's about choosing, again and again, to be a vessel for peace rather than a source of harm. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, when you find yourself tempted to react in anger, remember the Buddha's calm refusal to accept another's bitterness. When you feel the need to defend yourself harshly, recall Kasyapa's quiet dignity. And when words rise in your throat, ask yourself, will these words be a bridge or a weapon, a balm or a wound? This is the timeless art of wise speech, shaped by the stories of old, carried forward by the voice you choose to offer the world. In our final chapter, We'll gather these threads together, exploring how the way we speak ripples beyond our own lives, becoming part of something much greater. And so here we are. After walking through ancient wisdom, timeless stories, and the gentle, steady path of right speech, we find ourselves standing at a simple, yet powerful truth. The way we speak shapes not only the world around us but the world within us. Every word we choose is a thread woven into the fabric of our relationships, our communities, and our inner peace. Words can build bridges or burn them. They can heal wounds or deepen them. They can offer light in dark places or cast shadows where none need fall. The Buddha didn't ask us to speak like saints or sages from the start. He asked us to practice, to notice, to reflect, and to begin again each day, each moment, each breath, because speech isn't just about language, it's about presence, it's about intention. It's about remembering, even in the heat of anger or the fog of pain, that we are responsible for the energy we release into the world. Kindness in speech isn't weakness, it's strength. It's choosing to soften when it would be easier to harden, to clarify when it would be easier to deceive, to pause when it would be easier to lash out. And truthfulness isn't just about factual accuracy. It's about integrity. It's about speaking in ways that align with your deepest self, not your momentary emotions. So here's a gentle challenge and a simple practice you can carry forward. Before you speak, pause. Ask yourself, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it spoken at the right time in the right way with the right intention? You won't get it right every time. None of us do. But every moment you choose to be mindful of your words is a moment you rewrite the story of your life. And over time, those small, quiet choices gather power. They change conversations. They heal relationships. They dissolve conflicts before they bloom. More importantly, they reshape the inner dialogue you hold with yourself. Because how we speak to others is so often a reflection of how we speak within. Choose compassion outwardly, and you cultivate compassion inwardly. Speak truth to others, and you find it easier to be honest with yourself. In this way, as the Buddha taught, speech becomes part of the greater practice, a path not only to external harmony but to awakening. This is the ripple effect of words. A single kind phrase can shift a person's day. A gentle truth can untangle years of misunderstanding. A well-timed silence can prevent harm. And a voice, steady and rooted in wisdom, can inspire hearts across generations. You are that voice, right here, right now. So take what you've gathered from these reflections, from the ancient teachings to the humble stories, and let them live in your own words. May your speech be clear, may it be kind, may it be true, and may it lead you not only to greater peace with others, but a deeper, unshakable peace within yourself. This isn't just a teaching, it's a practice, and it begins now. Thank you for walking this path with me. May your words heal, may your truth liberate, and may your kindness ripple through this world in ways seen and unseen. Until we meet again.